Hey, this is Sean with the podcast Thrive Not Survive After Child Abuse. This is about number 70, episode number 70 or something. It's maybe a good time to tell you again for who this podcast is actually meant to be. Now, everyone is, of course, open to listen to my podcast. You're more than welcome, whoever is listening. But there is a specific group that I really want to talk to, maybe two actually. Right, first of all, I want to reach out to all the people who unfortunately have been a victim of abuse, and in specific, child abuse. Now, I know from my own experience that it is really hard to come forward. And in this podcast, I'll help you to come forward, if only to yourself. And that sounds maybe weird, but sometimes you have to admit things to yourself first before you actually can take the next step. So I hope you're not, by the way, but the numbers of child abuse are so incredibly high that's very likely that every other person that I speak to is a victim of some sort of form of child abuse. So if you're one of them, this podcast is something for you. Very often we do very serious topics, but I keep it sometimes light as well. I'm Sean Dorf. I'm unfortunately a child abuse victim myself. I was abused by my uncle from the age of 7 until about 12 years old. So that's a pretty long time actually. And I tell you my story of how I dealt with it, how I overcame with it, and eventually how I made from my mess, so to speak, my message, right? So if you recognize yourself a little bit in this, then this podcast is for you. Second group I would like to talk to are the people who actually maybe know someone who has been abused. And so you often want to give help, want to support people. It's not always that easy, right? There's a lot of emotions involved, a lot of shame and guilt in the victim. So we give you a lot of tips here, suggestions, and open discussions how to deal when you know someone. And sometimes that's someone very close. Sometimes you just find out after maybe a few years of a relationship with someone that the other person was an abuse victim, right? So you will find some empowerment, let's use that word again, in this podcast here as well. And then lastly but not least, I said there are maybe two main groups that I want to talk to, but definitely the third group is everyone else, right? And unfortunately, if you look at the numbers, that's actually a smaller group, but there needs to be, we need to raise the awareness of abuse in general, of what abuse is, or what the effect is on the people who are a victim, and short and long term, and of course how to deal with it. I sometimes say we are not different than other people. We just have something overcame us that not everyone had to go through, fortunately, right, fortunately. But in essence, victim of not. We just want to have a joyful, happy and healthy life with good relationships, and if possible, abundance in our life as well, right? So in our needs, we are not different than anyone else. I'm a child abuse victim. Sometimes I think these things are taken away from me of what happened to me when I was a child, but of course that is not true. We mentally feel sometimes different, physically sometimes too, to be honest, because abuse can have a pretty big physical impact as well. Anyhow, that's what this podcast is about. It is thrive, not survive after child abuse, right? Maybe not the most cheerful topic to talk about, but we can keep it cheerful in our talks, right? So, and there are enough other podcasts that maybe, address more cheerful topics. So listen to those as well. But I do hope that you start to support this podcast. My name is Sean Dorf. I am the author of Broken Silence. It's a best-selling book that addresses this topic. It tells my own story, and unfortunately it's not a unique story but it also tells, and gives you suggestions and tips. Some people say it's actually a workbook, how to deal with abuse, how to overcome it, and eventually how to be able to talk about it openly without constantly being triggered, right? So that's a big part of what this podcast is about. So next topic then is what actually is child abuse, right? It's first of all, there are two words in child abuse, right? The first word is child. So every person between the age of 0 and 18 or 16, depends on what country you live in, is a child, right? So anything that is done to this child without or with consent, is often already abuse, right? So that's often something that people don't understand, is that we have to protect our children, and they are not to a stage in life yet where they can fully be responsible for their own choices, right? Doesn't mean that we don't teach them something about responsibility, but they're not fully responsible of their own choices, right? So so that's a child. And now what about abuse then, right? Abuse can be verbal, it can be yelling, it can be cursing, it could be not talking to a child, it could be all these kind of things. It could be denigrating language, it could be negative language the whole time, right? You have to picture of this, right? That could be a form of abuse already. What else do we have, right? Physical abuse, obviously, right? There could be spanking, could be just pushing, it could be way worse. It could be of sexual nature, it could be just touching, and sometimes we don't want to say these things out loud, but it could be penetrating as well, right? So that's are the more extreme forms of abuse that I unfortunately had to live through myself. So unfortunately, we sometimes get to use two words and they lose the power of it, so to speak. So once we start to use a word too often, let's say in the media or something, and we say the word child abuse, then we don't fully always understand what's going on, right? So child abuse can be full-on rape multiple times for a long period of time in a child's life. Just think about that, right? Just think about the word rape still has its full power, I believe. So think about it, that could have been going on in a child's life. So it's very serious, very damaging physically, but also mentally and from a psychological point of view. And if you're a victim of that, it's not something that you would like to talk about the whole time, right? And but at some point in time, you have to step out in the world and bring everything that you have with you, right? You don't have to be ashamed for what have happened to you, but that's easily said and done, right? You don't have to feel guilty about what has been done to you, but also that is easier said than done. We often think that we are alone in this world about this, but that is unfortunately not true. If my story was unique, then it might have still been in a good book that I wrote, but unfortunately it is not a unique story. So there you go, and in the next episode I will reveal you all the numbers of sexual abuse, but you're definitely not alone, right? And it's an ongoing thing, and you would think after all these years of human beings living on this earth, and people still thinking that we are evolving to higher beings, I tend to actually disagree with that. Okay, maybe we upgraded our lives if it comes to housing and cars and all the stuff that we have. But if it comes to how we treat people, I still think that we don't upgrade it and evolved at all, If that would have been the case, something as evil as child abuse would have left this world already a long time ago. Unfortunately, it's still there, full force, maybe in worse cases than ever, right? So we have to do something about it, and through that, we as human beings have to, change our thinking around a lot of things. Think about, for instance, pornography, sexuality, stuff like that, right? If we don't start to address these things, I'm afraid things like child abuse will be with us for a long time. Now, I've been through it. I'm an old man already, 60 years old. So, to be honest, I don't care so much about what happens to me anymore. But I do have 2 kids, and they're young. And I don't want them to go through the same thing that I've been through. And I hope that one day they have the joy to have kids as well. And I hope that my grandkids, in this case, don't have to go through the things that I've been through either, right? Most of the people that listen to my podcast probably have kids too, right? So if we don't do it for ourselves, we have to do it for the generations after us. We have to make sure that the world that we leave behind is a much better place than what we found it, than how we found it. Does that make sense? And I do think, I don't want to be gloomy, it's too much nice weather outside anyhow. I don't want to be gloomy the whole time, but truth of the matter is that we don't, right? And if you're with me in this, right, I'm sure I'm not making the best podcast in the world, but come with me and help me make a better place for the generations after us. There are many topics in which we can do it. I try to do that in the world of abuse and sexual abuse, and we have to, get it out of the world. Maybe other people are more concerned about the environment, and that's good too, right? So everyone takes care of some piece of the puzzle. But I'm the first one to say I need help in this. We don't get a lot of attention. I know abuse is not a nice topic to talk about. It almost feels like the messages that we put out there are almost put down or suppressed or something like that. But so I hope that you made it to all the 12-13 minutes that I typically record. This was Jean from the podcast Thrive Not Survive After Child Abuse. I hope to hear you back at the next episode. It was episode 70, so I'll hear you back at episode 71. Bye bye.